Yeah, that's a really big question. So probably most immediately or urgently, when the pandemic shut down human movement, it forced us to take a different look on collaboration, scientific collaboration. What does that look like? Um, Typically, scientists go from their homes to their place of work. They've got laboratory facilities. They meet together once a week for laboratory meetings. They share what it is they're doing in the lab. All of that had to change. And so I think one of the primary things it did was it forced us to learn how to do a whole lot of work without having a whole lot of face time or individual time, right? It also forced us to be creative because we had an emergency on our hands. And whenever emergencies come up that are complex like that, or like any population level phenomena, it really forces you to think outside of the box. And so, in terms of, lasting effects from the pandemic, I think it's caused scientists to look at how they do work differently. All sorts of challenges were amplified that scientists normally had to deal with every day, like siloed data. How do I share my data with the right people? How do I share my analysis? Can other people repeat my analyses? So it was a really interesting time that I think produced some different ways of thinking about how we go about working. Yeah, regulatory processes are very tricky, even outside of a pandemic or a crisis. And it's because you are looking at a population level for how a therapeutic works. And just like we have a bell curve, you have the most amount of people in the middle that respond in a certain way. And then you have your various degrees of tail regions, right? So when you try to make population level decisions with therapeutics, it's not easy. It's really hard, right? And so I think, that not only has it always been a challenge, but that really amplified because generally you have multiple years to go through a lot of regulatory hurdles, a lot of really good process. But I think it forced us to take a look at, can we find some efficiencies throughout this process? For instance, why does it take a typical drug to go from 10 to 15 years in development, from development through regulatory process, and then if it makes it through into the market? That's a very long time. And when you're in an emergency, you don't have a long time to wait. And so again, it allowed us to really take a look at, how can we get more impact or more efficient with what we had. Yeah, well, probably you heard about Operation Warp Speed. And so at that time, there were a number of leaders from companies that came together to collaborate on finding a vaccine. And, that's unusual. Typically, commercial companies are in the business of coming up with novel therapeutics that other companies don't have. But in this case, there was a requirement for science to come up with a solution that could help mitigate the effects of the pandemic. Um, so that was unusual. The last pandemic we had was, very early on in our country's history. We didn't have the science or the infrastructure. So in terms of data sharing, you know, um, there were public databases that were set up over in England, I'm thinking, as well as here, that allowed for sequenced SARS strains to be deposited and accessible by people in the community. Okay, so you could get a really nice lineage view over time of how the virus was mutating and which different groups of viruses were starting to outcompete others, right? And so that shared data resource was really important. It's still important today. And that really, I think, gets to the heart of good science is what does collaboration look like? Yeah, huge. I mean, mRNA vaccines, so there are a number of different types of vaccines. There's mRNA vaccines, there are protein vaccines, so vaccines come in a couple different flavors. So mRNA vaccine was a really interesting strategy, and I think it bore itself out to be a very intriguing modality to look at future applications. So, again, underneath that pressure cooker of we've got a need today, we need to mitigate the effects of the pandemic today. That modality really had a lot of great attention paid to it. And when I say modality, that just, type of vaccine, since there are a number of different types. So I think it really opened up the doors to mRNA mechanisms, how we might be able to deploy them for other treatments. So it was, yeah, we got a fantastic amount of data and information from that. Yeah. Oh man, that's another really good question. So again, it amplified what we already had going on in our country in terms of embracing vaccines or being vaccine hesitant or being anti-vax. So those undercurrents have always been in this country. And again, when you get into a crisis mode, all of those get amplified. So how it will affect the population in terms of perception or sentiment, that's TBD. Um, the effects of COVID in downtown New York City was very different than in places like Billings, Montana, right? Where in New York City, you had 18-wheeler containers that were acting as morgues because the morgues were overflowing, right? But in Billings, Montana, you didn't have that. So you had such a diversity of effect. And so I think what it did was it really raised the bar for scientists for better communication. And when it comes to public health at the state level, at the national level, at the global level, science communication is critical. And if we're not communicating well, the onus is on us. And we have to really bring things out into the public so that they can understand them at a level that they can get, right? So we have to take it from the 25th grade level down to the eighth grade level. Not because of, intellectual capacity, but just because you're trying to get a complex message out to a very broad swath of people. So how do you do that effectively? Yeah. How did it change funding? That's still being determined. So, we have I mentioned the word modality. So we have a number of different types of modality to treat diseases or infections, whether it's CRISPR or DNA mAbs or mRNA vaccines. So in terms of funding, federal funding right now is kind of up in the air, in terms of cancer research or neurological research. But in terms of commercial companies or private companies, funding is something that is always gamble is kind of a hard word, but because a clinical candidate has to go through so much R&D and then the clinical trials, there's a lot of risk along the way. So what it's forced companies to do is look for ways to do more with less money. So to be more efficient, whether it's science or business process, or how many targets am I looking at once? Can I look at 1 million, or do I look at 1,000? And so when you're looking at scales of 1 million, that really imposes a lot of constraints technologically. And that's one of the things that we're working on is how do you deal with big biological data, find things that you would have otherwise missed because you're using methods to find patterns to identify that one candidate that treats the thing you want to treat. So it's a good forcing function in my view, allowing us to think out of the box and how do we do more for less. So when it comes to funding, those research dollars are precious if you can get them, right? And so you really have to be careful with how you're using them.